Welcome to the second video in the Scheduling Type Job Shop Models module. In this video, we'll pick up where we left off in video 1 with the model that we ended up with, and then we will look at several different concepts that are fundamental to scheduling type models. And those are custom objects, binding and importing tables, dashboards, dispatching, and work schedules. These are all relatively large topics, and all we're going to do in this video is pretty much a high-level introduction. We're going to actually work with some of these, but they're much bigger topics than we can cover in a single video. And so with this video, we're just trying to introduce the basic topics and demonstrate their use in a really simple model. So here's the model that we ended up with at the end of the last video. And as you recall, we had this is a 6-station job shop, and we used a data table to generate the object instances for the model. So we have a table that we called resources, and we showed how we could adding entries to the table created the object instances. We had a parts table, and in this case, we are not using part entities. We're just using a single order entity, but each part has a sequence, and then we have orders that arrive at a particular time, and they're for a specified part and a specific quantity, and we have a due date. We talked about the release date, so that if the arrival time was before the start of the model, we wanted those orders to arrive when we started the model. We tracked the completion date. We computed the total processing time for the order. We also did that for individual parts. So if we go back to the individual parts, we have that total processing time. We used a process on onRun initialize to compute those values, so that we don't have to input those values based on the sequence. And so that's the basic model that we ended up with in the previous video. One thing that I forgot to do is I wanted to name this model, so I'm going to rename this baseline model. And then we're going to start here with the material for this video. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the model so that we can keep our original baseline model. So I'm going to just hit duplicate, and then I'm going to rename this one custom object model. And so again, it's an exact duplicate of the baseline model, and so you have the facility view, the data, and everything else. So again, it's an exact duplicate of the model. Okay, so we want to look at these objects that we have. So we have server objects, and remember that they were created automatically from the table. And what we showed before, what I showed in the previous video, is that if we were to delete these and then recreate, so if we, for example, delete these and then paste back in from our Excel, which is what we did in the previous video, that we would get new server objects. So these would be deleted and the new server objects would come in, and then all of the custom property values would be lost, and so we would have to redo that. An alternative to doing that is we could use a custom object, and where the property values have the specific values that we're interested in. So the easiest way to do that is there are shortcuts. So I'm going to go to S1 here, and if I just right-click and scroll or move down in the menu, you see this create object from this. So what I'm going to do is just choose that, and we'll just leave a default name of my server here. And so I'm just going to click on OK. And you can see what happens when I do that is now we've created a new object called my server, which is based on the instance of the server object. But if we look at the property values, all of the property values are the ones that we had previously. So when if I compare to S2, for example, you can see that I have the processing time is sequence P time times orders quantity, and it's bold. So bold, again, means that it's changed from its default value. If I look at S1, I have that same thing, but it's no longer bold. And the reason it's not bold is because it's now the default value. So if I were to go over to the project library and drag one out, you can see that it inherited, or that it's using those default values that we have in our model. Also, when I look at the transfer node here, it's already set to by sequence. And so you can see that now I have an object called my server, which already has all of the values for the properties. So if I go back to my data, you can see that because I did that create from this, it updated my table with my server. So what I want to do now is just use that same value. So I just copy that and paste it. And now all of my server objects, all 6 of them, are of type my server. And so I choose that, and it has my property values that I want, but they're no longer bold because they are now, again, at their default value. And so now, if I were to recreate these, which I'm going to do here in just a second, we wouldn't have to go back in and change those property values because we are using the custom object, which has those property values already set to the default. So we have our 2 other object instances here. We have our order source and our order sync. And if we look at these, we also have property values here also. So I want to do the same process that I did to create the custom server object. I'm just going to right-click on my order source and create object from this, and we'll just leave that as the name of my source. So again, now we have in our project library, we have another source or another object based on the source object called my source. And if I were to drag one out, now its property values are defaulted to the ones that we want for this particular model. I'm going to do the same thing with order sync because it has its one state assignment where we assign the completion time for the order. So I want to do the same thing here, and so I'm going to create, oops, that's not what I meant to do. I want to create object from this. There we go, my sync. Now we have a sync object, and of course when I drag one out, it has that default state assignment that we expect. So now if we go back to our data, you can see that all of those are updated. Okay, so I'm going to now do the save to CSV. So do that, and now we have a CSV file called resources. I already had one, but I'm going to replace that. So there we go. And let me just open that CSV file here up. So bear with me here just a second. So there we go. It's opening up. I could drag it onto the other monitor. There we go. Make that a little larger. There we go. So we just created a CSV file based on that data table. And so now I'm going to go and bind this table to the CSV file. So let's go to create binding, and I want to have a CSV importer. We'll just take the defaults here for the CSV importer. And now we have this file name for importing. So I'm going to choose the file we just created, resources. And I'm going to go to binding options and set it to manual. Recall that if it's set to automatic, it imports the data on the start of every run. And I don't want to do that while we're doing this experimentation. So I'm just going to set it to manual. Now I have the binding set. And so now if I were to go in and delete everything, of course, as we saw before, it deletes all of the object instances. But I can then import the data from the file and it recreated. But because I'm using these custom objects, once it's recreated, we simply can run it. We don't have to go in and change any of those property values. So I could run and I could go in and say, okay, well, let's do planning and so on. And we haven't made any changes to the object instances once we imported them. And that's the really nice part about using custom objects in this context, is that I can use completely data-generated models. So let's see that in action. Let's pull up, here's our CSV file. Let's just add a couple more. So let's do server 7 and make it a my server. And let's see, I'll put those in just a second. Let's do S8, S9, and we're going to make all of these my servers. So hopefully you can see why I like doing this in Excel a little bit better than using the table editor. So I'm just going to put those, let's see. So they're going to all line up in X. Let's see where I want these to be. So -3 and 3.5. So those are 6.5 apart. So 6.5 and 3. These need to be 10, I think. We'll just try that. 10, 10, and 10. And so now I've said, okay, I want 3 more servers. And then I'm going to just save that value, go back in and import my table. And now we have our 3 servers. And if we go back to our facility, there they are, 7, 8, and 9. And of course, because they're type my server, they're already set up and ready to go. So when we could, at this point, run our model. Of course, we don't have any parts or any orders that go through those servers, but you can see that down here, they're included in the Gantt chart, because one of the defaults that we got that I hadn't mentioned before is if you go to advanced options, this log resource usage is set to true. All right, so now we have our new servers. Let's go back into data and let's export the part table. So I'm just going to export to CSV. We'll call it parts. Again, I've already done this. We've got there once. And let me open it up. It's opening here. Maybe. There we go. And so note for the part table, oops, I didn't mean to do that. There we go. We have this state column for total P time that's computed. So I really don't need that in my CSV file. So I'm just going to delete that. And then I'm going to add two more parts. Part E, part F. And we'll save that. And so now I'll go back to my model and bind the table. We're just going to bind and then bind this to parts. Go back in and set the option to manual, import the table, and then there's our part E and F. So again, we've imported those, and we have these new part types, but we haven't set the sequence, right? And we don't have any orders for them either, right? Because we just created those. So next step, of course, let's do the same thing with sequence. So I'm going to grab sequence, export to CSV, and then open it up. Well, we'll go ahead and bind it before I open it. Let's create the binding and make this sequences. There we go. And then let me open up sequences. Opened up down here. Let's pull that guy up. There we go. So I'm going to create our new parts. Part E. And let's do input at S7. I don't know, 10. Making this up as we go. Part E, input at S8, 5, oops. Part E, input at S9, 12. Part F, input at S9, I'm sorry, I want that S9, I want these to go backwards, so there's S9. We'll make this one short. Part F. Input at S8. 15. Part F. Input S7. 12. Part F. Input at order sync. I guess I forgot that on part E. So again, let's just go. Oops, that's not what I want. I want to insert a row here. If I could remember how to do it in Excel, Control. That's not working. I want to insert a row. There we go. At long last, and then I put it in the wrong place. Figures. So we'll just copy that and then rename this guy input at order sync. Wow, that took a lot longer than it should have. Okay, so we have our part E, which is 7, 8, 9, order sync. Part F, 9, 8, 7, order sync. So that all looks good. Go back into our model and import. And those imported, no errors there. If I go back to parts, now I can expand. And you can see that we now have imported the sequence for our new part types. And finally, we will export the order table. So we're going to do the same process. Go orders, save to CSV. We will save that. Overwrite the old one I have. Let me open up the new one. There we go. And as with the part table, we have a lot of columns that we don't need in our import. So let me just open all those. And so the release date is computed, completion time is computed, total P time and the targets we don't need. So we really just need the first columns for order ID, arrival date time, part, quantity, and due date. Okay, so let's save that. Let's go back in and create our binding. So we do that. We have orders. Set the binding to manual, do an import. Just imported the same thing. So again, the completion date, total P time, and all that will be computed. So let's go back in and order and create some orders for our new stuff. So go back in and orders, and we will just see if we can make this happen. We'll just create two new orders, 8 and 9. We'll have them arrive at when the system starts. So let's just copy that. And we want part E. And let's do 20 of these. Part F. 50 of these. We'll do a lot of these. Oops. Let me get back to Excel here. How do I do that? There we go. Orders. And then we need some due dates. I don't know what the due date should be, so we'll just make it this. We'll manipulate these here in a little bit. So we just created 2 new orders in our order table, one for Part E and Part F. So we go back in and now import. And now we have those new arrivals. So if I go back now to my planning tab, remember we ran this before when we created the parts. We created the resources, but we didn't have any parts. So it's going to reset and create plan. And now you can see we have our new orders, order 38 here, 39. And then if we go to our entity workflow, we can see those orders here. So one thing I want to do that I meant to do earlier and forgot is I want to fix so that we can actually see the order ID here rather than the entity number. So to do that, I need to go back to my facility and go to the order instance. And down here in animation, I want to do 2 things. First of all, I'm going to set the dynamic label text, orders, order ID. And then I'm also going to, in the advanced option, for the display name, have the same thing, order ID. And so now when I run the model in interactive mode, you can see the dynamic labels are the order numbers. And when I go to my planning tab and regenerate the plan, so recreate the plan, now we have the order numbers here so that we can relate those back to the order table. So here are the 2 that I just created. And we can see that order 8 goes from S7 to S8 to S9, and order 9 goes from S9 to S8 to S7. And then if we go to the resource plan, again, we can see those on order 8 here, here, and here, and order 9 here, here, and here. So you can see that when we use this combination of data-generated models, so auto-create, and having the tables bound to external files, that we could literally create this model from scratch using only data. So if we have an appropriate resource table, an appropriate part table, sequence table, orders table, all in CSV files, I could import all of those tables into the model and execute the model without making any custom modifications to the model. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is look at some dispatching. We're just going to do a high-level introduction of this topic. Note that I've already duplicated my model, so while I was off video, I just right-clicked on custom and did the duplicate, and then renamed it dispatching model. So again, I did that while the video was paused. I forgot to start the video again. And so what I want to do in the dispatching model is demonstrate how we can use dispatching rules. But the first thing I want to do is I want to incorporate 2 dashboards into our existing model. So note that dashboards themselves are a big topic, and we will do a deep dive into dashboards a little bit later on in a different video. So all I'm going to do in this one is just import 2 dashboards that I've already built. We're not going to talk about how they were built or the code. We'll do that a little bit later. So just follow along, and I've provided the XML files for you to download. So what I want to do is I want to go to the Results tab here, and then go to Dashboard Reports over here from the left, and then I want to import. So I'm going to import, there are 2 here. There's MakeSpan, so let's import that. And when you do, it's going to ask you what you want to name it. Just name it MakeSpan. And you can see what it reports is the ending time of the run. And so back in our model, if we do look at the facility view, if I just fast forward to the end, you can see that it ran to 25.75. That's exactly what the dashboard is telling me. So I'm going to go back to my results, and there's where that 25.75 comes in. Second dashboard that we're going to do, so I'm going to import, is a dispatch list. So let me import that, name it, get rid of the 1 there. And the dispatch list has a dispatch list for each station and overall. So over here we can see a set of cards, 1 card for each resource. And if I select one, then it zooms that resource state pie chart over here on the right and includes that dispatch list. So you can see S1 looks like it was busy about 66% of the time, And so you would think about this from a production standpoint, is that this dispatch list is what you would hand the operator at S1 and say, okay, at time 8, you're going to process order 1, time 9, you're going to process order 3, and so on. And it has these values for each one of our stations. And so again, we're going to talk about how to create dashboards, how to use dashboards a little bit later. So for now, just import these into the model, because we're going to use these to discuss dispatching. And one other thing I want to mention is that we created the dashboards here using the results tab. And so remember, Simio has 3 different, think about these as run spaces. You have the interactive run. So when I'm here in the facility and I run, then the results are shown here in the results tab. We also have the planning tab, and so those results are different. So the results that we see in the planning tab, whether it's the dashboards or the resource plan, are different than what we see in interactive mode. So for example, if I went here and reset this one, but then I go back and look at the results, so let's just reset the whole thing and then rerun in fast forward mode. If I look at my results, I can see my resource Gantt is there, right? So we have the resource Gantt for the interactive run, but when I look at the planning, we don't have it because the planning run is different. Okay, the planning space is different, and the same thing is true of dashboards. So when I go in the results here and look at my dashboards, you don't see anything because we haven't executed the plan. That's the issue. That's the reason they're not there. So if I go back into operational planning and go to the resource Gantt and say generate plan, there they are. So there's the generated the plan, generated, the resource Gantt, the entity Gantt, all of the logs, and then correspondingly, now we have those dashboards. So I bring this up because this can be confusing both to new users and experienced users, that we have these different sets of results, one for the interactive runs, one for the planning runs, and then when we have experiments, there's a third run space for experiments. So you just want to make sure that that you are looking in the right place. So if you're looking at the resource plan, for example, resource Gantt, and you want to be in planning, that you are in fact in planning and not in the results. All right, so let's look at some dispatching. So I'm going to go back to our data, and I'm going to go to orders. And what I want to do is I want to make all the orders arrive at time 0. So I'm going to go to my my orders CSV file, and just copy this value so that everything arrives at time 0. So everything is going to be there at the start of the run. And so I'm going to use that so that I can switch the dispatching rules, and we can actually see a performance difference. So let me do that. Let me go back in here, and now let me import. And now we see everything arrives here at time 0. And so the net effect of that is going to be when all of the entities arrive, everything that goes to S1 is going to be there at time 0. And so that we can then choose, or we can tell Simio to choose one based on different rules. So the default rule that is used is first in, first out. So the ranking rule basically says whichever one comes in first is going to go first. And so let's just run that as a baseline. So I'm going to do this in the planning tab. So I've got that set. I'm going to go back to planning. Then I'm going to create plan. There we go. And then I want to look at the dashboard that we added. So we added this dashboard for dispatch list. What I'm particularly interested in is the make span. Now, before we go any further, I just made up all of this data. So I'm not sure if we're going to get any performance improvement. And that's something we'll explore later on when we have some more realistic data. But just remember this number 24.9. And so we go back to our facility view, excuse me, and I say, suppose that I want to use a different ranking rule. Like, for example, suppose what I want to happen is when I have a list of jobs here, I want to pick the one with the shortest processing time. That's otherwise known as the SPT dispatching rule for shortest processing time. So when I have a queue of orders here, the question is, well, what is the processing time? We go back to our data and note that we have, for the order, we have a quantity of a particular part. And when we look at the part, we have the processing time. So this is the processing time for one part. So if I want to know what the processing time for an order, I simply multiply the total processing time for the part by the quantity in the orders, and that will give me the total processing time on that station. So I'm going to go to my ranking rule here, and so I want smallest value first, and I'm just going to put those values in. So we're going to have sequence P time times, oh, no, I'm sorry, we want, we do want, sorry, we don't want the part. So let me back up just a second. I don't want the part total time. This total time includes all of the processing. What I want in this one is I want the sequence. So I want the sequence P time because that's going to be at a particular station. So I'm going to go back, sorry about that, smallest value first, and I'm going to have sequence P time times orders quantity. Oops, sequence P time times orders QTY. There we go. Sequence P time times order QTY. And so for now, let's just do it on S1 and see if that has any impact. So we go back to our planning, and now it's 24.9. Go back to the resource plan, and let's just generate a new plan. I don't know if anything changed or not, so let's go back in and look and say back to our results. We're still at 24.9, so that had no impact. But let's see what happens when we do that on all of the other stations. And again, I don't know what's going to happen here because I just made up this data. Now, we could go in each individual one and set that ranking rule exactly like we did for S1. A shortcut for doing that is I'm just going to right-click here, and now just under Create Object from this, I have another option for Update the object with the property defaults. So I'm going to click on that, and now when I choose any one of the other ones, you can see that the ranking rule is set to how I have it set for S1. So in effect, what I did was I just changed the default property values based on the one that I actually set here. So let's go and see if that had any impact. So let's go back, generate our resource plan. So go back to operational planning, reset, create plan, and then go and look at our results. That's still 24.9. So let's see if we can go in and make something happen here. So let's go back in to our data. And let's just focus on here these part B. So remember when we look at part B is the one that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so what I want to look at is my part B's at station 1. And so you can see I have order 1 and order 3 are both part B. Order 1 is for 10 and order 3 is for 25. So they're already in SPT sequence because this one is going to be shorter processing times than this one. So let's just change this around. Let's make this 50, and we'll make this one, I don't know, see if we can do something drastic, 10. Okay, so now this one has a longer processing time than this one. And so if I go back and run my model right now, so we have these set to shortest processing time, then what I would expect to happen, oops, in my planning tab, let me go back, sorry about that. When I go back, is I would expect this one to be processed first because it's going to have a shorter processing time than order 1, where if I'm doing first come, first serve, order 1 should come first. So let's check that out. So let's run. So here we are in order 1 and order 3. So go back in and just do a create plan. And now we can see those two flipped because order 3 now has a shorter processing time than order 1. Okay, and so I don't know what the results are going to be. We can't really compare them because I changed the numbers. But let's just remember 43.7. And let's just go back in and undo what I did. So we'll go to S1 and change the ranking rule. I'm just going to reset it. Oops, I'm going to reset that to first in, first out. First in, first out, right? So now that's not the default anymore because I updated the properties. Let's do that. Let's go back here and then update. And so now that is the default. And so we're back to the model where we have first come, first serve. Go back to our planning. And now what we expect to happen is these two to flip because order 1 should happen first because it's first in the table. Go back in, create plan. Now, sure enough, order 1 is first, and then there's order 2. And now if we go back in and look at our results, now we have different make span. So you can see that by incorporating those different rules, then it's going to make the selection of which parts to do, or which orders in this case to do first. So let's look at one other quick one, and then we're going to leave dispatching. Again, we will spend a long time on dispatching rules, and we will use data that gives you meaningful results, where here we're just using made-up data. Another one that we commonly use is earliest due date. So if I look at my orders here, I want to process the ones that are due first. So these all look like they're due somewhere around the same time. So it's not going to be very interesting. So let's go back in our Excel and see if we can make some modifications to at least change these a little bit. So these are all due at 2/2 at 9 a.m. Let's make this one at 2/1 at, I don't know, 5 p.m. 5 p.m. There we go. And let's make this one at 2/1 at 9. So it's due pretty much right after it got there. And then we'll make this one at 2/1, well, I don't know, 11 a.m. So 2 hours later. So we just updated some due dates. Again, I just made all those up. So who knows if anything meaningful is going to come here. Import our table, and now we can see those due dates changed. So one thing we should see is the one that I made due almost at the same time it arrived. So order 4 is almost certainly going to be late. And so I can go in the planning mode if we want to just check that out. If I go in the resource view and create plan, and then I go to the entity workflow in order 4, yeah, it doesn't look like it's too late. It looked like the processing time was pretty small. So it didn't, in fact, it wasn't that late. So go back and look and say, why did I think this was going to be late? 8 a.m. Oh, no, this isn't the one that was right after it arrived. I'm sorry, that was order 5. So order 5 arrived at 2/1 at 8, and it was due 2/1 at 9. Go back to our planning, order 5. Yeah, so here's order 5, and clearly it's late here because its due date's right here. It was right after it arrived. So that little aside here, sorry about that. So now what we want to do is we want to use the earliest due date. And so we're going to give priority to those jobs that are due earlier. So what we want to do is go back here and say, I don't want first in, first out anymore. I want smallest value first, but this time I want orders due date. Orders due DTG. And then we will then update my server. And so now all of the servers are going by earliest due date. And so now when a server has a queue of orders waiting, it's going to grab the one that's due the soonest. So we go back in, and then let's see, go back to our resource, create plan. Not really sure if anything flipped around there. Look at my results, 24.9. So again, I definitely have a shorter make span here by processing orders that are due first. So that's the basic introduction that we're going to do to dispatching. Again, we're going to spend a lot of time on dispatching and show how we can use different values. In particular, one thing that you could experiment with, I'm not going to do it in the video, but remember when we did the data that we have this total part time for the part. We also have the total time for the order somewhere. We compute total time for orders. Let's see. Oh yeah, total P time. So when we run, we can also use these. So if I wanted to say create or prioritize an order that has the biggest total time, not just on any one server, but the biggest total time, I could prioritize based on this, or I could prioritize based on the parts. There are any number of different dispatching rules that we will see in subsequent videos. And finally, the last thing that we're going to do in this video is we're going to have a really brief introduction to work schedules. So if we look at our My Server instances, they are all fixed capacity. So we have initial capacity 1. So these are all capacity 1 servers, and they're available all the time. If we want to introduce a work schedule, that would be something like if you had human workers. So for example, let's suppose that we have operators for each one of these. Then operators work on a shift schedule, have breaks, and so on. So that's really simple to implement in Simio. If I go back to my data, I can look at the work schedules, and we're just going to use the standard one that comes that's there for us. We'll create our own work schedules a little bit later, but for now, let's just use the standard one. And so the standard one is based on a week pattern and a day pattern. The day pattern says we start at 8 a.m. and work for 4 hours. So work till noon, you have capacity 1. Then from 1 to 5, you have capacity 1. So this is an 8-hour workday with a 1-hour lunch break. And the week has a 7-day week, but you work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So it's just a standard work schedule. And so I can say I want to use those. If I go to S1, and instead of having fixed, I'm going to say work schedule. And then my initial work schedule is simply a standard week. And so you can see that it then applies that week schedule, lets me do exceptions and all of that. We'll talk about that later. So if we want all of the servers to use that same schedule, of course, we could go and do it all manually. And that might be the case if, for example, you had some automated stations where you wanted them to work 24/7 and others that were staffed by operators. For our model, we're just going to then use our favorite update my server from this. And so now when we pick any one, you can see that it's using that standard work schedule. And so now when I run, so let's just do that and let's go in planning mode. So remember, we have our results here. We're at 24.9 make span. Let's regenerate it using work schedules. And so the first thing that we're going to see if we go to our results is that we have a much longer make span. Well, that should be expected because now we're not working 24/7. If we go back to our resource plan, we can see this. If I just click on the little expansion there, what I want to focus on is this resource state right here. So the resource state, if I hover, I'm processing. So I'm processing this order, and this order. And right here is my lunch break. So now it's noon to 1. So we're off shift. Then you're idle. Then you have the arrival of order 4. Then you're idle. And now here's the end of the day. So 17 is 5 p.m. So you're off. On server 2, now we can see order 3. So order 3 was being processed starting at, what does it say, 3:10 p.m. So at 5, click here, at 5, this went off shift. So order 3 still shows as being processing because it is sitting there at S2 while S2 is off shift. And you can see how easy it is to incorporate the work schedule. In this case, we just use the default, but we can have as many work schedules as we want. So we could have first shift, second shift, third shift. You could incorporate morning breaks and lunch breaks and so on. We'll see some of that moving forward. And so all I wanted to do in this video is basically just show how simple it is to incorporate the work schedules, and then show you in the planning tab, when you look at the planning, how we can expand these views and sort of see how that incorporate, how those off shift times are incorporated into the schedule. And so we still have all of the dashboards that we had before. So again, if we look at the dispatch list, all of that is still available, except now that we have the shift schedule, we now have a new state. Instead of just processing and starved, we have this off shift time. And so all of these should be off shift for about 2/3 of the time. So we have 8 hours, or what do we have? 8 work hours, 1 hour off. Yeah, so it should be 66.7, 66.67 nominally. But of course, we're not running full days. Remember, we had the run time set to indefinite. And so the model or the run terminates when the last order is completed. So it's not always going to be exactly 2/3 here, but you can see that they all stopped at the same time. They're all 65.83. And so they all have that same off shift time. So that's the basic introduction that we have to work schedules. As I said, we're going to focus on work schedules a little bit later and do more complicated work schedules and have different work schedules for different resources and so on. So one final thing about custom objects. In this model, we created a custom object, a custom server object called my server, and all of the instances are of that object, but it doesn't have to be that way. So suppose, for example, in our case, the first 6 are all have operators, so they're all tended by humans. And so we want to follow this work schedule, but say 7, 8, and 9 is a production line that's completely automated. And so we don't want these to follow a work schedule. We want these, let's just say for the sake of argument, to be 24/7. Okay, so I could do that a couple of ways. One way is I could leave it my server and then just say, I want to make this fixed with capacity 1, and I want to make this one fixed with capacity 1, and I want to make this fixed with capacity 1. All right, so I could do that. So I could set those property values, and that would work. So when I run this, so if I were to run this planning in operational planning mode now, so let's do that, let's run there, we're going to see that 7, 8, and 9 are never off shift, right? Because we click there, click there, click there, they're never off shift because they don't, they're not set up with shift schedules. Alternatively, I could create a second custom object. So I could go in here and right click on this one and say, well, let's create a new object from this. Okay, we would probably never do this in a real model, but we'll just leave the default as my server. So now my server is a new custom object that's based on my server, right? Except in this case, it's different. The difference is that it has fixed rather than a work schedule. So if we went back in our resources, let's see, data, resources, there's my server, and we could make this one my server, and we could make this one my server. And so in this second way that I did it, I now have this custom object, and I could then say, we have automated servers and we have human attended servers. And then so we could then again automatically generate the model. Because if I use the previous method where I set the properties for each object manually, then of course when I regenerated the model, when I said, okay, I want to import the table, you see what happened is they all go back. So my customization of making these my servers went away, as would the customization for the individual properties had I done it that way. So we're going to see the use of custom objects pretty much for the rest of the semester in subsequent videos. It turns out, as I said, to be a quite useful feature. And so we will get more into that in future videos. We will also look in much more detail at the other topics that we covered here, being dashboards, dispatching, and the actual planning and scheduling tasks. So that concludes this video, and that also concludes Module 3.